Welcome in, everybody, to the much-anticipated 2026 NFL Coaching Carousel Breakdown. Today, we'll be going through all of the openings, all of the candidates, even filling coordinator positions for teams that maybe didn't make a change at head coach, but have some other key openings that'll play a role in their success next season. And I'm recording this here Thursday morning, January 15th, just after the news that John Harbaugh is officially landing with the New York Giants. No worries, that was all a part of my prep yesterday. There was a huge push by the Giants to get him, so this was much anticipated. He's even on the thumbnail for this video here in Giants garb. But now that that's locked in, we can actually kind of start with the Harbaugh conversation, maybe what I was going to say about it, and analyze his fit with the New York Giants. And then the rest of things won't change, which is nice. The funny thing is there was really no convenient time to do this video because 36 hours ago, Mike Tomlin resigned, so I couldn't have done it a whole lot earlier. Yesterday, I was planning on doing the show, but our furnace broke, so I had a lot of stuff to do around the house to make sure we weren't freezing our butts off, to get a schedule repaired. So we are doing it here this morning. But let's begin. And as we do, please do hit that like button. It really does show your support for the channel. Make sure you're subscribed as well, so you don't miss any of my draft content, all of my NFL analysis, you name it. But like I said, we're gonna, the order of the show here, we're gonna begin by breaking down Harbaugh going to the New York Giants, and then we're gonna proceed with the show as I had scheduled it yesterday. So how it's gonna look is I will kind of set the board for everything. I'm gonna first break down all of my top, 21 head coach candidates here for this cycle. I put together a little tier maker list for that, which will be fun. It was 22 before Harbaugh, so that'll kind of set the available prospects, if you will. Then I'm going to rank all now 8 head coach openings. You'll see where the Giants would have ranked there. I have some fun notes on why I ranked these teams the way I did, even a little grading system. And then it's basically going to play out kind of like a draft. I'm going to go down that board, starting with my number one best available head coach opening. And I'm going to kind of predict who I think lands in each of those spots as we go down the board. And then when we get to the end of the show, I'm going to go to those coordinator positions that are open throughout the league as well. So let's get into it. John Harbaugh landing with the New York Giants this morning, signing a 5-year deal. The Giants made a heavy push to really kind of like lock him in before other teams could really make their push. This was clearly the Giants' number one guy. I don't want to say they were desperate for Harbaugh, but it was pretty funny to see all the different reports about how they were whining and dining him and chasing him around on private jets, and just, this was their guy, man, and good for the Giants to get the guy that they really wanted. Now, as you'll see in this video, I was lower on Harbaugh as an overall candidate if I'm ranking guys in a vacuum. I do think it makes sense for certain reasons with the Giants. It wouldn't have been my favorite hiring if I'm a Giants fan, but I don't hate it either, and Jeremy Fowler put it well. The New York Giants have had 5 head coaches since 2016. The Brian Daboll regime had a lot of good things going on with it, but a lot of chaos as well. From just a kind of top-down team management stability standpoint, it wasn't exactly the most stable regime. And a big theme for this show is that teams certainly want to zig to their zag from their most recent hire. So if you had kind of chaotic situation, you're going to look for a stable candidate. If you were an offensive guy last year, you might go defense and vice versa. So it does make a lot of sense why the Giants just want the guy with all of the wins on the resume, the consistency across the board with the Ravens. Even in a very down year this year, you're still talking about them as about a 500 football team in Baltimore, a guy that knows how to assemble a staff, run a locker room, set a practice schedule, handle the New York media. There's a lot of things to like about John Harbaugh coming to the New York Giants. Now, a reason he wasn't my highest ranking candidate and why this wouldn't have been my top choice for the New York Giants is it just goes against the grain of what throughout the majority of the league tends to work for a sustained period of time. And you are trying to create a sustained winning window with the young Jackson Dart, a lot of young talent on that defense. I actually think this hire could look pretty good in the beginning, but the problem with a John Harbaugh is the same problem that comes with all these CEO-style coaches, whether it's Nick Sirianni in Philadelphia, what we saw with Harbaugh in Baltimore as they lose coordinators and struggle to replace them at times. It's just hard to consistently replenish coordinators when things go well and they go get head coaching jobs elsewhere, even if John Harbaugh is one of the best at locating talent from a coaching perspective and trying to fill out his staff with the right guys. But even all the way up to like Dan Campbell suffered this for the first time in Detroit, losing Ben Johnson. We're about to see it for the first time with his brother, Jim in LA. They're going to lose Jesse Minter this cycle. He interviewed with all 9 head coach openings. So the problem with the John Harbaugh is that he's only really as good as his coordinators. Yes, he can raise the floor with culture and that kind of stuff. But I also want to point out, I don't think that John Harbaugh is his brother. I don't think he's Dan Campbell from a culture building perspective either. I think John Harbaugh is a 60-year-old guy who his message ran stale in Baltimore. He's a guy that saw a lot of late game collapses, which is unfortunately an unfamiliar sight for Giants and these Giants fans. I think it should be okay, but I'm a little more worried that if they're not winning right away, that John Harbaugh is a little bit more of a passive mentality. And I'm not saying this in a negative light, but a lot of his messaging is like very religious, even keel, like a pastor over the organization, as opposed to his brother's much more like, let's run through a brick wall, baby. Dan Campbell, even Nick Sirianni. Like, I just think it's different. And does the kind of passive thing work in a new organization? There's just some concerns there. That's all I'm saying. I think he's obviously an established, successful head coach. And like I said, it's the floor of this hire that the Giants are going for. Now, as I mentioned, Harbaugh is only as good as the coordinators that he picks. And that's why it's going to be like my final reaction to how good this hire is for the Giants is definitely going to come down to which coordinators he ends up landing here. There's clearly one guy that I think he's going to try to bring over with him, and that's Todd Monken. His offensive coordinator in Baltimore would make a lot of sense. They know how to implement a design QB run game within that system with having Lamar Jackson and Tyler Huntley and Jackson Dart. I think whoever you pick for his offensive coordinator, you want to implement the design QB run game. It's something that Jackson Dart proved that he can do at a very high level. And there's some similarities, too, to how Harbaugh got Lamar to kind of take less hits and slide a little bit more earlier in his career. And hopefully that can be some good messaging there as well. So I think Todd Monken would make a ton of sense. He is interviewing for some other openings, whether it's the Bucs offensive coordinator position or some other head coaching spots. So there might be a situation where Monken wants to go elsewhere. If that happens, I think you open up a different can of worms in terms of who it could be. There's a joke that he's going to fall back to Greg Roman, who just got fired by the Chargers, who definitely knows how to implement a design QB run game. I don't think that John Harbaugh would go back to Roman after he just fired him a few years ago. But if that happens, I'm going to have some reservations. That was my main reservation on the Jim Harbaugh signing with the Chargers, was that he chose Greg Roman. So that would certainly be a concern. I don't think he's going to go that route. I think there's some other guys out there that would be a ton of fun to see in here and be successful. Some guys I wrote down were Cliff Kingsbury, formerly of the Commanders. I think his system could work well with Jackson Dart. Jim Bob Cooter, with the system that he's been learning under Shane Steichen in Indianapolis, I think could be a really good fit with this Giants offense. And then if they want to go more of the Shanahan style offense that so many teams are running, I would look maybe at like a Mike LaFleur or a Clay Kubiak, one of those coordinators in San Francisco or LA that seem to get hired every other year, guys that are able to be hired as your offensive coordinator, because I think they're both currently listed as the OCs on their respective team. But if they're taking a play calling role, it is viewed as a promotion, which is something to keep in mind for the duration of this show. So there's some names there that I would like for the offensive coordinator spot. And then with the defensive coordinator, I think there's an obvious top guy for this job, Anthony Weaver, who is getting head coaching interviews. He interviewed for Harbaugh's former position in Baltimore. There's a lot of continuity there, a lot of connections, if you will. Weaver was in Baltimore for a long time, as much as being, I think, their assistant head coach in Baltimore. And he went to Miami and I think did do a very good job running that Mike Macdonald system down there for 2 years, given that they didn't really have a lot of talent down there in Miami. So I think if you can get Anthony Weaver and Todd Monken to pair with Harbaugh, I really like that. And those are two coaches that are getting up there in age that might be slightly less attractive for a head coaching opportunity if you're talking about potentially losing those guys. So we'll see where that one lands. I think there's some other names. I do think the defensive coordinator that Harbaugh goes with will be within that Mike Macdonald coaching tree. I think Harbaugh loves what that system does, as he should. So, I think just perusing those staffs, whether it's his old staff in Baltimore or his brother's staff in LA or the Seahawks staff or the Dolphins staff, they're all basically free agents right now for the most part. It's, someone from those staffs that he would presumably know about and like through word of mouth. But another name would be Aiden Durd, who's a name that's going to come up a lot in this show for a defensive coordinator, even as a head coach candidate. And I don't want to spoil that too much, because our next segment here is ranking all of the head coach candidates. But someone within that Mike Macdonald system, I fully expect to be the defensive hire for the Giants. So I'm not going to give like a grade on it or anything like that. There will, like I said, the coordinator hires are going to be important there. There will probably be a time where I grade head coaching hires. Not sure when that's going to come, but let's go ahead and move on. Before I do rank all of the head coach candidates, I do want to thank the sponsor for today's Coaching Carousel show, Underdog. Enjoying these excellent playoff battles in tandem with Underdog Pick'em contests has been so much fun already in Wildcard Weekend, and I can't wait to keep playing through the rest of the playoffs here. For the divisional round, my favorite options for each game, give me Dalton Kincaid against Alex Singleton and that Denver Broncos defense. I think that intermediate part of that defense is how you attack them. I think the Broncos can slow down the run a little bit too. Then we got Brock Purdy throwing a pick against the Seahawks, 4 straight games with a pick for Brock Purdy, including one against Seattle Week 18. Drake May, rushing yards, higher against Houston. Really, the best way to beat them is scrambling against that front. If you see a lane exposed, we've seen some big scrambles from both Drake May and against this Texans defense. And then Matthew Stafford, passing yards. The nice thing about Underdog is you can flex these numbers up and down, just lowering Matthew Stafford down to 249 passing yards. He's done that in each of the last 5 games. I think he can do it in what I think can be a little bit of a higher scoring game in Chicago this weekend. Underdog is offering countless profit boost tokens as well. So stacking that on top of this pays 11 times your entry. Love how these pick'em contests keep you even more invested in these incredible playoff football games. So if you're signing up, use code TFG, and they will give you a bonus match of $75 when you play just your first $5. It's an excellent offer. Underdog's been great to work with, and thank you to Underdog for sponsoring today's video. All right, this is the fun part. I will now rank my top 21 head coaching candidates for this cycle, and there were some names that I excluded that are getting interviews and stuff. I just didn't want to go on forever about these candidates, and I would be pretty surprised if anybody off of this list of 21 guys gets a head coaching job. So here it is. Here's the whole list. My top 22. You can obviously see where Harbaugh was there. A little bit lower than Giants fans were hoping for or maybe expected. But I broke these down into tiers. So I'm going to actually start at the top of this tier list. There's 3 clear top tier candidates to me in the tier 1, the great candidates category. Now, I will note there's no clear elite candidate this cycle. To me, an elite candidate, and you guys know I don't throw the elite term around on this channel very often. I want to keep that reserved for a very select few in whatever topic we're discussing. But to me, the creme de la creme of head coach candidates are the offensive-minded head coaches that are proven offensive minds. 3 main reasons I say that. Number 1, it's an offensive league. To have someone like a McVay, a Shanahan, other names in that list that bring that high-end offensive play calling to the table is the best way a coach can impact the game, in my opinion. Number 2 is when you have either defensive head coach or like a John Harbaugh, you're going to be worried over the course of time when you do find a good play caller that he's gone. It just makes things a little bit harder over time, increases your margin for error to consistently develop and find new play callers. And number 3 is, man, there's just, I think, honestly, a lot more prominent, great defensive minds out there. A lot of failed head coaches are defensive-minded guys that can be brought in as your defensive coordinator. And I've actually become obsessed. If you can find that setup where you have the offensive-minded head coach and the failed head coach that's the defensive guy that most teams just aren't going to give another look as a DC, that to me is like the dream setup where you're like both your offense and defensive runways are locked in. So there's no offensive, peak offensive candidate this year. There's some good ones, but no peak ones. But there are 3 excellent defensive-minded head coaches that are, to me, the 3 most qualified head coach candidates of this cycle. So in my top tier, I have Chris Shula is my number 1 choice, but all these guys are a little bit different schematically speaking. One might make more sense for another team, and they're all top options. Either way you slice it, you could order these top 3 really in any order. But number 2, I have Brian Flores, who I think is probably the best defensive mastermind of these 3 guys. But I'm a little more intrigued of Chris Shula, maybe the first time head coach with the legacy of being Don Shula's grandson. Flores we have seen as a head coach, and I will defend that he was very underrated as a head coach in Miami, but it did come with some stuff. Ryan Fitzpatrick has a good breakdown about how, from a personality standpoint, he can clash with some people. So there's at least a slight ding in Brian Flores' regard there. And then Jesse Minter as well from the Chargers, who's kind of the next Mike McDonald, if you will, literally was the next Mike McDonald following in his path through that kind of coaching tree, and has done just such a good job with that Chargers defense. So that's my top tier. And then we get to a list of guys that I just think their resumes are still really good, but I wouldn't put them in the same tier, obviously, as those top 3 guys. So my number 4 head coach candidate is Clint Kubiak, who I think is going to be the best offensive-minded head coach option out there. This is going to come down to how he interviews. There's no doubt that with New Orleans last year and with Seattle this year, he's done a great job. He's also the top mind for if you're looking for that next guy in the Shanahan McVay tree, that's Clint Kubiak, right? His dad, Clay Kubiak, was Mike Shanahan's right-hand man all those years. That system is tightly knit together. So that wide zone play action oriented system, going to be a great option as long as he interviews well. There's been some noise about his personality not necessarily being that leader of men type. That's just what I've heard. I'm not going to hold that against him until we see that play out. I would definitely hire Clint Kubiak as a head coach, especially if you're looking for an offensive-minded guy, which I think you should be. And then Jeff Hafley is number 5 for me, has done such a good job with that Green Bay defense. Look, Packers fans know what a bad defensive coordinator looks like. And Jeff Hafley is not one of those guys. He has reshaped this defense both schematically and just the bones, the personality, the character of this defense. You can feel it. The way they tackle, they were last in run after catch this year. Yes, they got Micah Parsons, and that turned this from a good defense to a great defense. And then I would say they went back to just being a good defense once Parsons got hurt. But I think Hafley did a great job in his first year when he didn't have Micah Parsons. So, and he's a former head coach as well, just at the college level at Boston College. You hear this guy talk. He's a head coach. And look, Matt LaFleur knows that Jeff Hafley's getting one of these jobs. So he's number 5 for me. Then I got Aiden Durd at 6. This guy is a really fascinating option to me. He's British, so he comes with the British accent. But he has really racked up an impressive resume. He was in Dallas with Dan Quinn when those defenses were really surprisingly good. Obviously, Dan Quinn got a head coaching offer off of the heels of that. And then he goes to Seattle and joins forces with Mike Macdonald. And we've seen, and he's the listed defensive coordinator under Mike Macdonald there. And we've seen, obviously, just how incredible that Seahawks defense is. So he has learned multiple systems, was with Dan Quinn running a lot of cover one, more of a kind of man-oriented 4-man front in Dallas, a multiple front, but just definitely a different system than Mike Macdonald, who runs this split safety, quarters-oriented match zone defense with a very diverse front and a lot of interesting blitzes that come out of that scheme. So Aiden Durd to me is someone that hasn't called plays as a defensive coach. That's another reason I will throw his name out there for defensive coordinator openings as well, like we did with the Giants. He can take that job, even if it's the same title. It is viewed as a promotion if you then get play calling opportunities. So definitely one of the more interesting, exciting names. I would love to see him get one of these head coaching jobs. Number 7, I have Mike McDaniel, who I still believe in. There's definitely some he's just he needs to be a little bit more of a unique fit. I think the personality needs to be put into the right spot. Like Mike McDaniel with the Giants was never going to make sense, right? Like they wanted the leadership floor raiser of a Harbaugh. There's some fits, though, if it's more of an established culture or if there's another guy in the building that can kind of mesh well with the quirkiness of Mike McDaniel. And then his system is also so unique, man. There is not an offensive scheme in the league that is more different than what Mike McDaniel does. Now, part of that might have been just the limitations with Tua, but their run scheme is full of crack toss and pre-snap motion and unique formations, and the passing game is very oriented around a QB that will trust intermediate throws, run the RPO game. So it's more of a, you don't want the square peg round hole with Mike McDaniel. So that kind of slid him down a little bit, whereas I think some of these other coaches, you can kind of drop in wherever and it'll make a lot more sense. But I still really believe in Mike McDaniel. I tweeted out that it's my opinion that 2 years from now, we're still going to be talking about Mike McDaniel as a top 10 head coach in the NFL. And I don't think I would have moved on from him if I was Miami. I think a lot of the talk about players not wanting to play for him is nonsense. That the Dolphins showed a ton of fight this year. They won as many games as you could have possibly hoped for, given what we thought about that team heading into the year. And they improved on both lines, like offensive line and defensive line. They showed dramatic improvements as the year went on. So I don't agree with that narrative that he can't run a locker room or that guys don't want to play for him. guys want to play for people that know ball and put you in a position to succeed at the end of the day. And Mike McDaniel does that. And then I had Robert Saleh. Seemingly everybody that leaves the Jets these days is doing better, whether it's Sam Darnold or Aaron Rodgers, Geno Smith, you name it. I think Robert Saleh did do a tremendous job with that defense until he didn't. There were some ways that roster was constructed in that final year. I think they became very thin up front, and that hurt them. Some of their moves, not finding a nose tackle, getting rid of John Franklin Myers, really for no good reason at all. I don't know how much Robert Saleh had to do with that. And then you surround that with the Jets of it all and the Aaron Rodgers of it all. It got messy at the end of the Jets days, but I still think that players want to play their ass off for this guy. He did just an outrageous job with the Niners defense that had no business being even somewhat competent. You see them flying around against the Eagles in the playoffs, doing as much as they can there. No pass rush whatsoever with all those injuries. You lose the leader of your defense in Fred Warner, and they were still functional. So I would hire Robert Saleh. He's not my top choice, obviously. He's pretty far down the board at this point at number 8, but he's on my mind as an option. Then we've got the next tier of guys where their resume is just either unproven or a little bit more shaky, but guys that I'm intrigued. If they get hired, I won't have a negative outlook on it. It's just more let's see how it goes. Grant Udinski, to me, is the biggest wild card in this hiring cycle. He's the guy that reminds me the most of Sean McVay, where if he does get hired, it'll be who, but a 30-year-old offensive mind that has been under Kevin O'Connell and now Liam Cohen in Jacksonville, very much in that McVay, Shanahan, specifically McVay coaching tree. And he has not called plays. I can't remember if McVay had called plays when the Rams hired him. I feel like being under Shanahan, he wouldn't have. So it doesn't scare me too much, but it would be something with Udinski, kind of he's the offensive Aiden Durd. Just his resume is he's a lot younger and his resume isn't quite as built up at this point as Aiden Durd. But I would love to see him maybe go somewhere as the offensive coordinator. Jags fans wouldn't like to see that, but go see what he can do as a play caller for a year, and then maybe he can be one of these really young hires that works out for someone. But if he gets a job, I wouldn't be surprised either. I just think you want to pair him with someone probably with former head coaching experience, whether it's an assistant head coach or the defensive coordinator was a head coach, something like that. Joe Brady, his name has fizzled out a little bit this year. The Bills' offense has been good, but stagnated a little bit. Their inability to push the ball downfield has been a talking point. I think it's largely related to personnel. They just don't have the guys to do it. But I still like Joe Brady. He did an amazing job last year with this Bills offense, and he was the offensive coordinator with, yes, Joe Burrow and Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase. It's nice to coordinate a college offense with those guys, for sure, but it was the best offense I've ever seen in any level of football, probably, at least not high school, but college and NFL. Then Todd Monken, we talked about him with the Ravens. He's getting head coach interviews. I like Todd Monken. He's a little older, but experienced guy, diverse system, pro-style system. I like him as an option if you want to go that route. He's solid. Anthony Campanelli, he is in that Jeff Hafley, Robert Saleh system. He goes to Jacksonville this year as their defensive coordinator. I would think he falls behind Jeff Hafley in the pecking order. Those guys are two peas in a pod, in my opinion. But Campanelli did do a really good job with that Jags defense, so he's going to be getting some looks, I think. Matt Burke is a name. He's getting some interviews. Another one of these guys that he's beneath the guru in Houston. He's beneath D'Amico Ryans. But anytime a defense plays at the level that defense is playing at, you're going to get some looks as the defensive coordinator of that unit. Another guy that maybe wants to go call plays somewhere else as a defensive coordinator. But Anthony Weaver, who we talked about did a really good job in Miami. Much more of an experienced guy. He was even, I believe, I could be wrong about this, but I do believe he was listed as the assistant head coach in Baltimore, a highly respected guy. I think a high floor hire that brings a lot of defensive prowess and brings that Mike Macdonald system that is the modern meta of the NFL. Thomas Brown, interesting name here. He's kind of had a roller coaster couple of years. He was the offensive coordinator for Bryce Young's rookie year, so that wasn't so hot, right? Then he goes to the Bears and ends up their interim head coach. Did some good stuff until he didn't. But that was kind of an unfair assignment, I think, because wasn't he the third head coach for the Bears? Am I making that up? I feel like he ended up the third head coach, because didn't they fire Eberflus, then named Getsy or Waldron the head coach, and then fired Waldron? Or at least Thomas Brown changed roles multiple times within the same season. But it was a weird year in Chicago. But he got some love for what he did stepping in as the interim for Chicago. And then most prominently recently, he's the passing game coordinator with Drake May in New England, which has been a smashing success. So he's just kind of an interesting name that seems to have an appeal about him from a personality standpoint. He's been in a bunch of different buildings in terms of like learning offense and that kind of stuff. I like that he's had a Shanahan background, and now he's learning more of a traditional pro style system under Josh McDaniels. So he's an interesting name to keep an eye on. I don't think he gets a job this cycle, but I'm very intrigued by Thomas Brown. And then I have this fourth tier here. Call it the D tier if you want, but it's retread head coaches that I'm just less interested in, that I would rather go in a different direction. Harbaugh was one of those guys. Now, as with any of these coaches, there's going to be certain fits that make more sense, especially as you talk about retreads. Some teams just do want that head coaching experience, and I totally understand that. To me, it's just like, if I'm ranking head coach candidates in a vacuum, that's less ideal. If you buried yourself in a hole from a organizational standpoint that that's what you value most, I do get it. But again, we're ranking these guys in a vacuum. There are going to be multiple guys on this list that I do place as head coaches, though, in our next segment. But don't need to talk more about Harbaugh. He was at the top of the retreads list. Cliff Kingsbury, unlike Mike McDaniel, who I defended the idea that he does get the locker room to play tough behind him, a narrative that I think is inaccurate on Mike McDaniel. Cliff Kingsbury, that was a huge problem in Arizona, man. This really felt like truly just a play caller who was in charge of an organization. And maybe he learned from Dan Quinn. I'd be interested to see if it goes that route, but it's just a little early for me. It is. I would have liked to see a couple more years. And the thing with Cliff, too, and it's another narrative type of thing, there's the idea that, like, once his gimmicks run out, does he have different tricks in his bag? I think we were still in the process of learning if this was going to be sustainable in Washington. I don't get why Washington fired him. I think he was doing an excellent job. So I love his offensive prowess. It's just, for me, the Big 12 personality, the squishy, soft, scared defenses, the just squishy, soft, scared teams that I watched in Arizona, a little bit more turned off by him as a head coach, but I guess I could put him in the I'm intrigued category. Sounds like I hate him. I don't hate him. I just think he needs to be an offensive coordinator for a little bit longer. Matt Nagy, again, like, retread that I'm intrigued by, I guess. I'd rather not go this route, but it wasn't a nightmare in Chicago. They were well-run teams. It's just Matt Nagy's offenses weren't any good, but how much can you look at that and be like, that one critical mistake of drafting Mitch Trubisky and hitching your wagon to that, how much did that just truly hold them back? I mean, clearly Mitch Trubisky was not it, never was. So I guess I could split this category up. Like, I'd rather not hire these guys, but I am at least intrigued by, I would say, the top 4 guys here: Harbaugh, Kingsbury, Nagy, and then Stefanski next. The last thing I want to say on Nagy is, after the Trubisky pick was clearly a failure, their counterpunch, their last effort to find a quarterback was Nick Foles. So I have some real questions about if Matt Nagy knows what he's looking for in a quarterback. So if you're hiring Matt Nagy, I think you want to have that established quarterback. I don't want Matt Nagy picking the quarterback. I'll say that. That's where he really disappointed. But then okay, I know I'm spending a little bit extra time on Nagy here, but I do think, he has the Andy Reid background. He runs that kind of modern pro spread system, which I like. At the end of it in Chicago, he wasn't able to run his stuff. He wasn't. Again, it was his fault that he had Mitch Trubisky, but he had to dumb down that offense so bad that it left such a bad taste in our mouth. I'd be interested to see what he could do in a new opportunity. And then Kevin Stefanski, I think Kevin Stefanski has become extremely overrated. People are spending way too much time looking at the 2-time Coach of the Year award. Coach of the Year is a joke anyway. How often do we see middling head coaches get that award just because he was on a team that shattered their win total expectations? Like, to have won this award twice it just never should happen, man. I mean, the first time, sure, he's got the young Baker Mayfield. The offense was working. He's an offensive guy. 5 years ago or whenever that was, like, he looked like a great hire out the gate. But the second time he won it was literally just on the heels of Jim Schwartz and that defense being an incredible unit. Like, Kevin Stefanski really didn't have much to do with that team at all. They bring in Joe Flacco, and they just throw a bunch of YOLO balls, and Flacco and Amari Cooper made a bunch of amazing plays happen. There was effectively nothing from a schematic standpoint that Kevin Stefanski impressed me. And I have been actively asking on this channel for probably 3 years now for Stefanski to show me that he's able to scheme things up and make things easier on the quarterback. It feels like every QB that they slot in there, whether it's a veteran, Deshaun Watson, or the rookies that they've gone through, everybody seems to play below their expectations with Kevin Stefanski. And I need to see him call plays again as an offensive coordinator before I'm hiring him as the offensive coach of my team and the leader of my organization. Because it's not like, from a culture perspective or being the head coach, it's not like he was brilliant. I think he's fine in that regard, but I'm just not as high on Stefanski as an option. But he's highly sought after because of those 2 media awards. Then we got Vance Joseph. In Denver, the defense has been awesome. I just think he's a defensive coordinator. I do. We've seen him as a head coach, and it just felt like this list of defensive coordinators that get the position, whether it's Dennis Allen or I think even going back to like Steve Spagnuolo or Aaron Glenn, I think is where it's headed. Some of these guys, even all the way up to like Vic Fangio at times, like some of these guys just aren't meant for that next step and are meant to just be defensive coordinators. That's just kind of where I'm at with Vance Joseph. And then Arthur Smith is getting some interviews. I do think the league is a lot higher on Arthur Smith than the media. I'll say that. I think Smith did himself no favors with the fantasy community, with how he uses his players. I think he knows how to call plays. And I think also the way he handles the media and his press conferences, like he's kind of short-tempered, and I just think he needs a PR guy is really what it comes down to. But I don't think Arthur Smith stinks in the way that so many people do. But as a head coach, I don't know. I don't think he's the best candidate. And then hard pass on Mike McCarthy, who's getting head coach interviews, and for some reason the league loves this guy, but I just think he's so limited as the leader of your organization. So I wanted to include him there because we might see him get a third opportunity here because he's won so many games over the years. But just watch any Mike McCarthy playoff team after like 2012, and you'll see the character of his football teams on true display. So there's your candidates. All of the analysis has been laid down for what these guys bring to the table there. Let's now take a look at the now 8 head coach openings. And I thought it would be fun to come up with a little ratings system here. I did put together my own list just off the cuff, but then I thought, hey, it'd be fun to actually try to, break these things down more specifically and come up with a little bit of a ratings system. I don't need to spend too much time on this, and I don't want this to be taken like overly seriously. It's not like I spent hours like finding the perfect ratings for all of these different splits, but you can take a look at it there. Pause the video, whatever it might be, but it's just a 1 through 5 ratings system for, I think, all of the most important sort of categories for what the average head coach candidate is going to look for in these destinations, the biggest of which is going to be the QB situation, which I gave a quarter of the weight. And then the roster at large, is it a good team? That was another big factor at 17.5%. Ownership as well, by the way, is another quarter of it. Who you're working for is a big deal, and a lot of these owners have reputations, right? Whether it's good or bad. So that's the biggest chunk of it, is who's the QB, what does the rest of the roster look like, and who's the owner. But also kind of in the between 5 and 10%. I've got cap flexibility. How much cap space do you have? How much dead cap are you looking at? Draft capital, a big part of it as well. So like, how much room do you have to improve this team? And then also the GM situation. I just gave a 5, the highest rating, to a coach that gets to pick his own GM. The only spot left for that is going to be the Falcons. I think that is the most desirable thing you can have as a head coach, is that you're being brought in tied with the GM, as opposed to you come in and you're working kind of for somebody. But some of the other front offices are better than others, right? Like I have the Ravens and Steelers, very like prominent, renowned front offices. Everybody else is a little bit newer for the most part. I did have the Browns as a 3. You could argue that should be lower. Andrew Berry has mixed results in there. So maybe in hindsight, I would lower the rating on the Browns GM situation there, but they're already last on the list anyway. And then I have the Giants as a 1 with Joe Shane. I did have a front office tier maker video about 3 weeks ago. If anybody missed it and you want kind of my thoughts on some of these front offices and where they sit and what they've accomplished over the last 4 or 5 years, just a little plug there. And then also factored in there, not as important, but certainly a factor, is the location and the market. Is it a warm weather state? Is it a big market? What's the income tax? And then also team prestige as well. Is this a sought-after position from a team legacy standpoint? That's just 2.5% on the full equation there. Yeah, there's your head coach openings ranked. I will read it off because I know some of you are listening to this in podcast format on the Fully Inflated Football Show. So at number 1, I have the Baltimore Ravens. That one's pretty clear. I mean, you got Lamar, you got a renowned front office, and an ownership group that is respected. That's key. Number 2, the Atlanta Falcons. So when I ranked these off the cuff, I actually had the Giants 2 and the Falcons 3, but with the ratings system is what we're going with these with this list. The Falcons ended up number 2, but a lot of talent to work with, and especially on the defensive side now, some of the guys that they found through the draft, those edge rushers. You've got a secondary to build around there with Watts and Bates and Terrell. A lot of exciting pieces there with the Falcons. Then the Giants at number 3. You've got a quarterback in place. Unlike Atlanta, you got to figure out that QB situation. And they're going to have a new GM. So there's definitely some moving pieces with Atlanta as well. But the Giants have an incredible D-line and a promising young quarterback. So that was the main reason they came out number 3. The Steelers, from a roster window standpoint, are kind of a weird team where they don't have a quarterback. They have a very old, expensive defense. It's a good roster for the most part, but you're kind of coming into a weird situation where obviously Mike Tomlin had a hard time bridging through this kind of purgatory. So that's kind of the worry if you take this job, is like, what's our plan to get through purgatory? It's just a little more messy in terms of which direction you go with there. Do you keep trying to win with this, or do you actually talk about shipping off some of these veterans and maybe rack up some draft capital and look at the 2027 draft class or that kind of thing? So they're just kind of a unique situation. The Tennessee Titans at number 5, a little more clear cut, right? You're going there because you like Cam Ward. That's kind of the selling point there. The ownership has given you no reason to believe in them. I do like the GM there, Borgonzi. But there's work to do with Tennessee, to say the least. Arizona, they're intriguing. You have an existing front office there that I think is probably on the hot seat, but they've done some good stuff. This team just needs to stay healthy. You do have a Kyler Murray situation to kind of figure out as you come into this building. So there's just a little bit more existing stuff to sort through if you take this job. But there is a lot to work with. There's some really exciting players on this team. I don't think it's a bad job there for Arizona, certainly. And then you have the Raiders. I still think from a kind of team prestige market perspective, there's some allure to this job. You do get Ashton Ginty and Brock Bowers. You got the number 1 pick, so you get a clear, it's your choice of who the quarterback's going to be, whether it's Mendoza or you're building this thing up for a QB in 2027. You got a big, open runway. This is clearly going to be a rebuild. The appealing thing of the Raiders is the team prestige and the fact that you get to build this thing really from scratch. You do have John Spytek there to work with, but who wouldn't want to work with John Spytek? I think he was a big land for the Raiders, but there's a lot of work to do as well. And then you got the Dolphins at number 8. I mean, the biggest appeal of the Dolphins is Miami. I mean, who wouldn't want their dream job as an NFL head coach in Miami, Florida? It is a destination job. Now, you've got an ownership group that has earned very little benefit of the doubt. You didn't get to pick the GM or anything like that. It is a clear pecking order of owner, GM, then you. So that's kind of the opposite of the Falcons job, for example, where you're probably going to get hired first. It might not play out that way necessarily, but that does matter. And then most importantly, I mean, they're in QB flux and not a ton of cap wiggle room right now. They're building closer to it, but obviously you're inheriting Tua's contract. I don't think you're inheriting Tua. Maybe you just go through a rebuild year and just leave him out there to dry for a year. But yeah, I'll just say it again. There's a lot of work to do in Miami. And then the Cleveland Browns, which is this is the opposite of coaching stability, right? This is kind of the job that no matter what the roster looks like, you just are a little scared taking the Browns head coaching job, I think. They are just in that, bottom rung of organizations. It's them and the Jets, where it's it seems like no matter what they do, ownership's going to get in the way and you're going to fail. So you do get a great defensive roster. You have very little to build with on offense, though. You have to inherit I guess it depends on your perspective. You either have to inherit the Shedeur Sanders situation or you get to inherit Shedeur Sanders. He played really bad football down the stretch after a little bit of promise out the gate against the Raiders and Titans of all teams was really the high point for Shedeur. So I think most coaches are going to look at that as something they'd rather not have to deal with, but not a deal breaker or anything. But yeah, the Browns are going to be the last team that we slot in for here. So like I said, we are going to go through this list and slot in really my predictions for who I think they go with. Part of it is my own rankings and how I view these candidates, but that's also how I think the NFL is going to view these candidates on average. Every team's going to have a different list, though, like I said, but I'm kind of going for accuracy here as opposed to one of my what I would do mock drafts. I'm trying to nail this, and I'm going to take credit for being 1-for-1 on Harbaugh. You'll just have to take my word for it. I had all of this prepped yesterday, but Harbaugh was my prediction for the Giants. Not that I deserve much credit for that. It was very obvious yesterday that was near and in. But obviously we'll be skipping the Giants here and beginning with the Baltimore Ravens. I do just have one quick shameless plug before we do that for all of you guys that have been around the channel and love my Studs and Duds series. As I announced at the end of our midseason Studs and Duds breakdown, that series is moving to Patreon to be exclusive content. It will also be available here on YouTube for all of my YouTube members. But it will be there on the bottom tier for my Patreon, which is just $2.50 a month. This was something I spent a lot of time asking you guys about and thinking about making this move, and it is now my decision to move Studs and Duds over there to Patreon. And after this video, that's my next order of business, is I'm going to be working on the NFC East Studs and Duds. So I wanted to remind you guys that is happening and where to find it. That Patreon link is in the description below, or again, YouTube members here will also get access to that. All right, let's begin our head coaching draft, if you will. And the number one head coaching opening, the Baltimore Ravens. And I'm going to try to keep the order of these conversations consistent. So what I'm going to do is give you my top 3 choices for this fit. And again, it's not always going to be as simple as looking at my top head coach candidates and being like, well, obviously Jesse Minter, Chris Shula, and Brian Flores are my top 3 choices for every team. I'm trying to be more nuanced about factoring a little bit of like what's realistic for this team. Like, you know, guys like Flores and Chris Shula might not consider some of the bottom jobs, but also considering like, what are the teams looking for? Factoring what I said earlier, where some teams are going to zig against their zag and go the opposite direction. If they were a defensive coach last year, they'll go offensive coach this time around. So what are the just like top 3 best, most realistic choices for these teams? That's where I'm going to start. Then I'm going to give you my prediction on who they hire. And then once we break why that's the prediction down, I'm going to give any relevant coordinator hire options. So if you go offensive head coach, we will discuss who the defensive coordinator is going to be. If it's a CEO, we'll give the both coordinator options for you. So just trying to predict the head coach and then listing some of my favorite coordinator options for that fit. So the Baltimore Ravens, my top 3 choices for this team are the top 3 guys on the board. This is the number one most attractive job. When you think Baltimore Ravens, I think defense. Something I was just thinking about when I was driving the other day, there is an extra appeal, I think, to an elite defensive mind if you do have a quarterback that you think is going to give you a good offense no matter what, and especially a veteran quarterback like Lamar Jackson. I feel pretty damn confident that whoever his coordinator is going to be, you're going to have a really good offense. So if you can get him an elite defense like a Belichick to a Brady, for example, that's a perfectly like great setup. We haven't really seen a lot of that. I mean, the closest thing is like McDermott with Josh Allen, but I don't view Sean McDermott as an elite defensive head coach like you would with a Belichick, obviously. Maybe we're building towards that with Ryans and Stroud, but Stroud is obviously a lot younger and you know, not Lamar Jackson, basically. So I love the idea of the Ravens just locking back in with elite defense to support Lamar Jackson. Make it so Lamar only needs to score 24 to 27 points a week. And any of these top defensive guys would be a slam dunk. I can see Flores fitting here. I can see Chris Shula fitting here. But this is, let's be honest, man, this is going to be Jesse Minter. I wouldn't be surprised if it's announced this afternoon, honestly. Like, this was the biggest lock of this head coaching cycle. I'm so confident to just sit here and say I am now 2 for 2 on coaching predictions because this is so easy. Jesse Minter was Baltimore's guy. Like, he followed Mike Macdonald throughout that process when this scheme was becoming the prominent defensive modern meta. I think the Ravens internally, I don't think they regret not firing Harbaugh to like move on from McDonald. That would have been unprecedented off of the year that they had. But they certainly feel like Mike McDonald is the guy that got away. They get an opportunity to recapture that with Jesse Minter, who's done a tremendous job with the Chargers defense, and has even more to work with in the secondary. You have your hybrid safety in Hamilton that can do a lot of the stuff he did with Derwin James in this system. And Minter's used to working with a bad defensive line. He did it with the Chargers, and that's the biggest problem with the Ravens is manufacturing a pass rush. So Minter to the Ravens, an easy choice. It's going to happen, you guys. I would be stunned if this isn't the direction they go with the connections and how much of a fit it is. Now, he's going to have to pick an offensive coordinator, and there's a good list of guys to take this job. I would love any of these four names: Cliff Kingsbury, Todd Monken, staying put in Baltimore, which I think is probably not off the table, Brian Daboll, from, formerly of the New York Giants, and Jim Bob Cooter is another name that hasn't been mentioned yet. I guess Brian Daboll hasn't either, but he's much more of a well-known name, obviously. But Jim Bob Cooter is gonna, I think, be a name to keep an eye on here. He's the offensive coordinator under Shane Steichen in Indianapolis. That offense obviously did an excellent job here this year. Jim Bob Cooter was very young when he got his first opportunity in Detroit with Matthew Stafford, and I liked what he did at the very beginning. It obviously didn't work out because Detroit was kind of a mess. But I really like kind of the different schemes he's learned under. I would love to see Jim Bob Cooter calling plays again. And he's someone that, with Daniel Jones and in that Shane Steichen offense, knows how to implement a designed QB run game as well. And that was kind of something I thought of with this, is like, I want coordinators that know how to utilize Lamar as a runner, but not be full Greg Roman either, where you're just all heavy personnel and this true gimmick offense. So I would love any of those guys. Again, Cliff Kingsbury, Todd Monken, Brian Daboll, or Jim Bob Cooter as offensive coordinator options with Jesse Minter would be slam dunk. All right, the Atlanta Falcons are up next. For me, I want an offensive coach here. You're just coming off of having a defensive coach. They also have Jeff Ulbrich there, and he did a really good job with Raheem Morris. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. I don't think Jeff Ulbrich is necessarily getting a head coaching job anytime too soon. It'll probably eventually come up, but I just love the idea of, you got all this offensive talent. You have a young Michael Penix who doesn't have to be your guy, but you get to work with Michael Penix. I think that's the way I look at that and see how it goes, but with the wiggle room to maybe find a guy in the future. Unfortunately, the Falcons do not have a first-round pick, so obviously the quarterback situation is something you're going to have to really sort through here. That's the big overarching problem with the Falcons, but I want an offensive coach here. Pair him with Jeff Ulbrich and get the most out of this offense. Clint Kubiak, he's interviewing here. So my top three choices for the Falcons, and another note on my top three for all these teams, is I tried to do my best job at looking at who they're actually interviewing. I didn't want to put guys on here that they might realistically not be interested in. So that was factored here. But my number one choice for the Falcons is Clint Kubiak, who they have interviewed. Our top offensive-minded head coach candidate would be coming back to the NFC South here. There's some familiarity there. And the Falcons also have been in this Shanahan wide zone family that I think you probably want to stay in. Bijan's gotten really comfortable in it. The offensive line is fully crafted with wide zone run blockers, and that's Clint Kubiak's game. So that's a natural fit. Mike McDaniel as well, still in that family of offense, but I wouldn't hate it there. You've got Jeff Ulbrich, who's got a little head coaching experience kind of next to him. He was the interim with the Jets. And I could see that being a good fit with Bijan and these playmakers. Kyle Pitts, and then Grant Udinski is another guy that, why not just swing for the fences? See if you can find a Sean McVay here. The Udinski is just interesting in the sense of, like, it could be a disaster, but he has the highest upside, I think, probably out of any of these guys, because, man, you listen to him talk, The system works. Being in the McVay tree, he's everywhere he's been. The offense has been successful. So like the upside with Udinski is tremendous. You give him a long runway. It would remind me a little bit of the Saints going with Kellen Moore, where it's going to be a couple years until you can really figure this quarterback thing out. Maybe it is Michael Penix, but that's my top three. And I think it will be one of those three guys. But I think this is the Clint Kubiak destination. Kind of like I said, the wide zone fit makes so much sense. There's familiarity there in the NFC South. There's a lot of upside in this hire as well, with him being a young guy that has really developed, I think, as a play caller over the years. So pretty easy fit in my opinion, and that's my prediction is Clint Kubiak to the Atlanta Falcons. And then I think it's pretty obvious you stick with Jeff Ulbrich. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. I don't need to really list anybody else off. As long as they're hiring an offensive coach here, I would be pretty damn shocked if Jeff Ulbrich is not your defensive coordinator there in Atlanta. Okay, our next team is going to be the Steelers. We obviously broke down the Giants, who were my number 3 slot here. So the Steelers, my number 4 team, and their top 3 choices here. Number 1, Brian Flores. It just feels like such a fit with him and that defense. The Steelers' defense, like obviously they've built this roster to be a defensive powerhouse. And the reality is, Mike Tomlin, for as great as he is, has a defensive background. And Terrell Austin, they've probably underachieved with that defense over the last 2 to 3 years. And Steelers fans know it, but I think it's been a little bit quiet in the general view on this Steelers team because they do still kind of win games despite their QB play. And they do have some games where the defense takes over. But, man, you got all that D-line talent, but they haven't been able to really figure out the secondary. There's a lot of miscommunications, but they've also just become a very predictable defense. I think the Steelers have been the most predictable defense in the league. That all these great offensive minds just they know how to get open looks and they know how to predict what coverage you're going to be in and they know how to beat it. So Brian Flores is the complete opposite of that, dude. Like he is the opposite of predictable. The variety of his coverages, the blitzes, you name it. And he's got a great personnel here to come in and do exactly what he did in Minnesota. There's actually a lot of similarities where you have a dynamic edge duo or edge trio, honestly, is really where it's familiar. They had 3 guys there in Minnesota down to Dallas Turner as the edge 3. Same deal here. And you have 3 outside linebacker style guys that all are great at dropping into coverage. That's a big part of Flores's blitzes and the confusion is you never know at any given moment when these edge rushers are going to spot drop. And you look at like Van Ginkel being a guy that actually can get into zone coverage and know what he's doing. TJ Watt, very underrated part of his game. He's brilliant in zone coverage. Nick Herbig has a background doing that, and I think Highsmith can do it as well. So I love that. I love the interior guys that they have. It's a great fit. I think he can get the most out of this secondary. I would love to see what he would do with a Jalen Ramsey as a safety piece with a full offseason as a safety. So Flores, to me, is a no-brainer to get this defense to be an elite defense. I mean, just think of those Vikings defenses over the last few years, and that dropped into Pittsburgh. Holy hell, man, that gets me excited. Like, that's where you could get what just kicked your ass in the playoffs with that elite Texans defense. You could get something close to that again in Pittsburgh. So Flores is my number 1 choice there, but likewise, the other defensive guys, Chris Shula, Jesse Minner, the same logic applies to get this defense really humming. Now, you definitely could make a case to go the offensive route with the Steelers because they've got QB uncertainty. You kind of get to pick which direction you want to go with there. You could go just kind of take a swing for, Grant Udinski or Clint Kubiak or whoever and maybe go for more of the Kellen Moore style long-term rebuild there for sure. I guess I can't shake the idea of the roster talent on this defense getting to work with premium defensive coaching. So for my final prediction for the Pittsburgh Steelers is that this is the Brian Flores destination here, that this is a fit for the reason we described, and that's the route they go, and they kind of continue with the I guess, general approach, general philosophy of the Steelers kind of forwarded by defensive prominence, if you will. And then, obviously, who they pick for offensive coordinator is going to be very important here. I do think Arthur Smith returning is possible. I don't need to keep defending Arthur Smith every time his name comes up here, but with not a ton to work with, I think the Steelers' offense was generally pretty solid for what it was this year, and I think they've built a very interesting thing there with all the heavy personnel and all that, but I think with the way things ended with Pat Freiermuth kind of voicing some frustrations, with Darnell Washington getting hurt, and the way that playoff game finished might be the last we see of Arthur Smith in Pittsburgh. But I would definitely be interested in Brian Daboll. Him and Flores working together would be such a fun narrative because of the lawsuit stemming from Daboll's interview in New York and the lawsuit over the Rooney interview and all of that whole story. But I don't think Flores has any reason to hold any animosity towards Daboll for that. And I think Brian Daboll, at least as an offensive coordinator, would be a really good option. And these guys do go back to New England. So that's why Bill Belichick had both their phone numbers to begin with. So I like Brian Daboll as a fit, getting to kind of do things again. He spotted Jackson Dart. I like the idea of like, okay, if it's Malik Willis or if we're drafting a guy next year or whatever, I think Daboll getting a chance to maybe lift this offense up would be a great fit. I love Mike McDaniel here if you're able to land him, but there's probably going to be more appealing jobs for him. Cliff Kingsbury, same thing applies, and Jim Bob Cooter as well. I think some other options too could make sense. If you're not able to be a super attractive job for some of these bigger name offensive coordinators, down the board a little bit, like Zach Robinson is still out there from Atlanta, or maybe Bobby Slowick. You kick the tires on him after he was really good a couple of years ago in Houston, and then they let him go. There's names you could go with there, but we are going with Brian Flores, obviously, for the Pittsburgh Steelers. All right, my number 5 ranking opening was the Tennessee Titans, the opportunity to go work with Cam Ward, who I think is underrated as we head into next year. It was a really tough season for Cam Ward with what he had to work with a changing coordinator midseason and just a bad Titans team. A lot of miscommunications in that offense with the change in coordinator and everything. So I like the idea of still trying to find the right offensive coach for Cam Ward. But the Titans are a team that I think could go in any given direction because they theoretically, you want to pair Cam Ward with the young up-and-coming offensive mind, but they also just tried that in Callahan. And if you're being realistic about how teams tend to operate, it's that they typically go in a different direction. So I don't know that like the Clint Kubiaks and Grant Udiskis with the kind of unproven coach resume would be their path. I don't know that going with a defensive coach would be their path either, because you have Cam Ward that you want to put a good infrastructure around. So for me, I think their most realistic candidates are going to be an offensive-minded head coach that has head coaching experience, if that all makes sense. So it's a more limited pool. I do think if you're able to attract Chris Shula or Brian Flores, who I don't think they've interviewed Flores, or Jesse Minter, if you're able to attract any of those, great head coach candidates with great resumes, I think you go that route for sure. But I don't know that they necessarily will. Maybe they do. But my prediction for the Titans is one that I don't think Titans fans are going to be that excited about, but this is just kind of what I think happens. And it's Matt Nagy from the Kansas City Chiefs. The other top candidate in what I think they're looking for would be Kevin Stefanski, but there is a little bit of, they brought in part of the Callahan family. I don't know how much this would play a factor with Bill Callahan. Brian Callahan came from Cincinnati. I don't know if they'll be necessarily interested in looking up to Ohio again. Maybe I'm overthinking it here. Stefanski would be an interesting option here, but I actually think Matt Nagy, as someone that has head coaching experience, like I said, the ship didn't have holes in it in Chicago when Matt Nagy was there. It's just, instead of a battleship, you were flying a little steamboat, with Mitch Trubisky. I do think Matt Nagy ran the organization relatively well in Chicago. He handled the head coaching duties. And again, I think that's what Tennessee is going to be looking for, is someone that can raise the floor, but also work well with Cam Ward. And I really think, as much as Matt Nagy doesn't get me super excited, he does make a lot of sense in this spot. And that's why I'm predicting it. He also, I will say, is an excellent scheme fit with Cam Ward. I think Cam Ward, with the quick release, really good in the gun. You can do some, different arm angle stuff, a lot of the screens and creative different things that they've done with Mahomes in Kansas City over the years, the mobility, the play action rollouts. I do see a lot of parallels from a skill set perspective between Mahomes and Cam Ward. And I think Matt Nagy, also exactly what we said earlier, was that I like him in a spot where he doesn't have to pick the quarterback, right? You are coming here with the quarterback in place, and I believe in that quarterback much more than I did Mitch Trubisky. So as long as you're giving him the right QB, I would be interested to see how this goes. So that's what I got. Is Matt Nagy for the Titans is my prediction. Would it be necessarily my top choice? I think I've talked myself into it making a lot of sense. And sometimes you do just have to find the right fit instead of looking at a vacuum at your top candidates. And look, Nagy where was he on my list of coaching candidates? He was 18th overall on my list. But I think as you go down the board, he just might be the guy that makes the most sense. So we'll see what direction they go there. But again, that's my prediction, is Matt Nagy. And then you got to find the right defensive coordinator. So I think Denard Wilson's doing an okay job there. He's in the Mike McDonald system, the modern defensive meta, all of that. I don't think it's crazy to just keep things going with Denard Wilson. If you want to keep that same schematic continuity, but you're not the biggest fan of Denard Wilson, you could think about like Anthony Weaver. I don't know if there's anybody on that Chiefs staff that I'm not thinking about that maybe as a long time, my goodness, so many coaching names are rattling off here. A long time Steve Spagnuolo disciple. There's probably someone that's been in that building that maybe if you want to stick with the Chiefs thing. Oh, and by the way, I didn't even make this connection, but Borgonzi came over from Kansas City. So you could kind of really create Kansas City East in Nashville here. So, man, I'm kind of really talking myself into this as a fit that could maybe surprise some people. Again, I'm willing to give Matt Nagy a second chance. So maybe that's something I didn't look far enough into, is if there's someone on the defensive side there under Steve Spagnuolo, that would make sense. But another guy I wrote down that could also be exciting if you wanted to be a little bit more creative is Jim Leonard from the Denver Broncos. He's a defensive associate coach out there. I think he's actually their secondary coach. But I think Jim Leonard's a hot name with the way that defense in Denver has transformed over the last 2 years. Vance Joseph, obviously a big part of it, but Jim Leonard, the former Wisconsin Badgers head coach when the Badgers were a much better team. Or actually, he wasn't even the head coach, was he? He was the defensive coordinator in Wisconsin, but he's doing a great job, and I think that's a guy that Tennessee could certainly look at as well in a similar kind of 3-4 system if you don't want to mix up the personnel too much, because I do want to keep 3 those 3-4 concepts, just like in Denver, they use, it's not 3-4, it's more 5-1 and, creative fronts and stuff. They do base 3-4. But what I'm trying to say is Tennessee has 3 really good interior defensive linemen. I want to keep those guys on the field as much as possible. So I was kind of trying to think in the 3-4 breadth of schemes. But if they want to go the Steve Spagnuolo route, you'd be more of a 4-man front. Anyway, we're going a little bit too far into the defensive side of things here. We're going Matt Nagy to the Tennessee Titans as my prediction for that opening. Okay, at number 6, the Arizona Cardinals, our next available opening here. I just want the best coach here, whether it's offense or defense. And I do think Chris Shula here is your top choice if you're Arizona. Strictly, I mean, he's probably going to get a job no matter what, but you get to for sure steal from the LA Rams, and a big part of their success is Chris Shula. The last 2 years, he has transformed that defense. I think there's a lot of similar body types in the Arizona Cardinals front, a lot of different types of pass rushers. That's what Chris Shula has really gotten the most out of with the Rams, is just athletes and moving guys around and finding matchups and running stunts. Chris Shula would just be an outrageous upgrade over Jonathan Gannon, comparatively speaking. So he would be my top choice. And in that same line of thinking, not to be redundant, but Brian Flores, Jesse Minter, if you those are the top 3 candidates, right? So those would be great for Arizona. But if you want to shift from the defensive-minded head coach, Clint Kubiak would also be a great hire in Arizona. It's a similar system as what they've really built there for the last few years under Drew Petzing. It's that same wide zone Shanahan family, but you're stealing him from Seattle. So the other thing with Arizona that I didn't mention, and a big reason I said I just want to swing for the best coach possible, is that you're in this division, and I've said this before, but you're in this division with an unbelievable slate of coaches, right? You have Shanahan, McVay, and Mike McDonald. Probably, certainly those Shanahan and McVay would be my top 2 right now, and McDonald's probably top 5. So, you got to keep up with this division. And I think you have to be a little bit more on the aggressive side of things here to swing for that level of coach. So I think Chris Shula could be that. I think Clint Kubiak could be that with his scheming prowess. And then I wrote down Aiden Durd, also stealing him from Seattle. I think he has tremendous upside. And Grant Udinsky, who we've talked about as kind of the wild card of this hire. So I'm just swinging big for high upside coaching candidates. That's my list right there. I am going to predict that they land Chris Shula here. It's just going to come down to how the cards, pun unintended rather, but it's just going to come down to how the cards fall there. I think they would love to steal Chris Shula from the Rams. So that's going to be the route we go there. But again, any of those guys on that list, I would be pretty excited to swing for things. With any of those names. So for the offensive coordinator, if we're going with Chris Shula here, I wrote down Brian Daboll, and that's especially if you are going to keep Kyler Murray, which, man, I've talked about this, but I would stick with Kyler Murray. I understand that he is one of the most heavily criticized quarterbacks in the league, that things kind of have run their course here in many ways in Arizona. I think a lot of that was just the way the old staff meshed with him. I don't think it was ever a scheme fit with Kyler Murray in a Shanahan-style offense. It just didn't mesh. Now, a new staff coming in might see if they can kick the tires on Kyler Murray as opposed to the alternative, right? That's the biggest thing in Arizona. And I think bringing Chris Shula in here, this team's not that far away. I think you're looking at a top 10 defense next year with Chris Shula and an offense that has a lot of pieces, right? Michael Wilson breaks out this year. I still very much believe in Marvin Harrison, despite what the fantasy community is going to panic about there. Trey McBride's the best tight end in football, especially with Kittle now having to come back from that Achilles. I think you got to make some improvements on the offensive line, but man, I'm willing to kick the tires with Kyler Murray in a system that fits him much better. And for me, I can't think of a better fit than Brian Daboll. who understands how to use the QB run game. It's a lot more shotgun in a Brian Daboll offense that I think you want Kyler operating from the gun, just from a pure physics standpoint, more room to see from the passing game perspective. I've loved that fit. I've been calling it out for a long time. I would love Brian Daboll with Kyler Murray here. Now, if I know Cardinals fans are like, no, that ship has sailed. It's not going to be Kyler. If you're trading Kyler, getting picks, realistically, your quarterback is going to be Jacoby Brissett. I don't know what other path you go there. Like, is it Kirk Cousins? Like, no, I think it's Jacoby, and then you're eyeing the QBs in the 2027 draft, especially with Moore returning to Oregon here. But if you're going Jacoby, I mean, you have to stay in a Shanahan-style system, especially Chris Shula, who's coming from the Rams. That's going to be the guy or the system you stick with, right? That's kind of what he's comfortable with and knows works. So there's a long list of guys you could go in that family. You could look at Zach Robinson, who just left the Rams a year ago. You could look at Mike LaFleur. You could look at Kevin Stefanski if he doesn't get a head coaching job. That would be fun because Stefanski was over Drew Petzing, who you might just keep Drew Petzing around here. Clayton Adams is another guy that would be interesting, who they just lost, but isn't calling plays in Dallas. Do you try to draw him back maybe? The other guy that I did write down as an option if you are sticking with Kyler Murray is Jim Bob Cooter, who, again, spread style system, can use Kyler's legs. There's options there, whichever route you want to go. But this would be ideal for the Cardinals is Chris Shula. And just to reiterate, Clint Kubiak, Aiden Durd, and Grant Udinski were the other guys I liked there. All right, the Las Vegas Raiders are our next head coach opening here by the rankings. So this is another very unique opening. It reminds me a little bit of like the Houston Texans a few years ago, where it's kind of a blank slate rebuild. They tried to like stretch this thing out with Pete Carroll and signing a whole bunch of different veteran players and keep the defensive coordinator in place. They tried to kind of go from this consistently the 20th best team in the league and try to take that step up, maybe be like a wild card team with Pete Carroll raising the floor here. No, this very clearly now needs to be a full-scale rebuild. I think you're talking about trading Max Crosby. We'll see what they do with the number one pick, right? That's going to come down to which coach ends up landing here. I think it's reasonable if you like Mendoza. I'm excited for the college playoffs to finally conclude here so I can finish my Mendoza eval and actually have a firm opinion on him. But I think it's also reasonable if someone really wants him and you can get 3 first-round picks and more, because he's the only quarterback this year. If someone thinks he's like there's a lot of talk about him being like one of the most desired number one pick QBs in a while. I don't know yet. If you end up disagreeing with that opinion and someone has that opinion and you can get like a whole ass like draft and a half worth of picks to retool this team, I think it's something to think about. But like I said, it's a blank slate here with the Raiders. And I don't know necessarily which direction they want to go after Pete Carroll. I don't think this is a super attractive job for like your top candidates. That's the main thing. Like, I certainly don't think, especially when the top candidates are defensive guys, I don't think Shula, Minter, Flores are looking at this like, oh yeah, I can come in and, have a great first year with this defense. Like, I don't think it appeals to those guys. I don't think a lot of young, like, I don't think Clint Kubiak and Grant Udinski, maybe they love Mendoza. Maybe. They'd probably have no idea at this point if they love Mendoza, though, because Udinski just finished his playoff run and Clint Kubiak's still in the playoffs. They're not taking time right now to watch Mendoza. So unless a young offensive mind is sold on Mendoza, I don't think those guys are going to love this Raiders job. So you're kind of left looking down the board a little bit more and asking, like, okay, what kind of makes sense here? Who wants to come in and run this rebuild? Again, probably not going to be a super young guy that wants to make this his first job. I think you're probably talking about a retread head coach that, like, wants that opportunity if it's there. So the three names I wrote down for the Raiders as most realistic landing spots, in my opinion, number one, Matt Nagy, who we did already place to the Titans, so he's obviously not going to be the prediction here. But I think interdivision, give him another chance. At least Mendoza's the obvious choice in this case. It's not like you're allowing Matt Nagy to screw up. Like, no one would call it a bad process to pick Mendoza at number one. I think there's different routes you could go. But overall, again, I think Matt Nagy getting a second opportunity would make sense here. I think Kevin Stefanski makes a lot of sense here. Just experience, offensive mind, getting that chance. I think Robert Saleh here, if he wants to rush back to getting a head coach, could think about this. He also might just say, I'll wait another year for a better defense to work with. And then I did write down Jeff Hafley. Like I said, I think the Raiders are going to want someone with head coaching experience, something of value to the Raiders here. In the case of Hafley, at least it's not his first time as a head coach, generally speaking. It's not going to be an unfamiliar role for him because he did it at Boston College. But I also think from the Raiders' perspective, too, I didn't mention this, like, things are kind of a mess right now. Like, you've got players basically at the end of the season talking about how much it sucks there. I mean, the Pete Carroll, it did the opposite of what you expected. He left things worse from a locker room culture perspective than how he found it. So I think having someone with head coaching experience from that perspective does make sense. So again, that's my list. Matt Nagy, Kevin Stefanski, Robert Saleh, and Jeff Hafley. Not the most exciting list, especially if Hafley isn't strongly considering this job. My prediction for the Raiders is Kevin Stefanski. And my opinion on that is that it would not work out. This would remind me so much of him in Cleveland. But that's in a weird, twisted way. That's kind of why I think this is what happens. But that's where I landed with them, especially with Matt Nagy already going somewhere else. Just not an easy choice for this Raiders team, but I would be interested with kind of a clean slate. I think that is what Kevin Stefanski needs if he's going to be a head coach, is a clean slate or just a supercharged offense. But I don't know that exists for him as a realistic possibility. But as far as the defensive coordinator hires for the Raiders, I think it's probably run its course with Patrick Graham. I don't think he's back there. I guess someone to keep an eye on there would be Jim Schwartz. If the Browns do move on from him, you could reunite those two here. I think that's been a really good pairing. But some other guys that could make sense is Raheem Morris, kind of pair Stefanski with a defensive coach that kind of gives Stefanski that same idea where he's got the failed former head coach as his defensive running mate there. I think Anthony Weaver would be a good candidate for this job. Jim Leonard, if you want to steal him from Denver, could make sense. But yeah, the Raiders were certainly a tough one that I struggled with, for sure. Then we get the Dolphins at number 8. This one's pretty easy from a predictive standpoint for me. There's two guys that I think are their guys. It's Chris Shula and Jeff Hafley. And if Chris Shula wants to take this job, fantastic. I mean, you got the legacy hire there. It would remind me a little bit of when D'Amico Ryans took the Texans job, where he's this elite defensive coaching candidate, a young ascending guy out of the NFC West that really had no business taking the Texans job, but because D'Amico had played for the Texans, there was a connection there, and he went home to take that job. Chris Shula, the grandson of Don Shula, the legendary Don Shula, what a fit, right? So if you're able to sell him on the legacy, the grandson's legacy, Hell yeah, dude. I love that. I just don't know if he cares about that or not, or if he'd rather go to a team that, has defensive roster talent, which the Dolphins really don't. There's a couple pieces. Like, I like what Jordan Brooks did this year. Kenneth Grant hopefully can continue to get better. I do think Chris Shula could do some fun things with Chop Robinson, but man, to say he has work to do there would be an understatement. And then the backup plan, I think, is Jeff Hafley. They just hired the Packers front office member to be the GM. There's a obvious connection there. I think Shula will have his true pick of the litter, whereas Hafley's a really good candidate, but he's behind three other top defensive coaches, right? So if you're going down the board a little bit, if Shula picks somewhere else, Hafley as a landing spot here makes a ton of sense. And then as a backup plan, if you strike out on both those guys, Anthony Campanelli, who was in Miami a couple years ago, went to work for Jeff Hafley in Green Bay. So again, that kind of Green Bay recreation with the front office coming over. And he did a great job in Jacksonville. Send him down the highway there. Come coach the Dolphins. I think that would be another good fit from a defensive standpoint. And they're all defensive coaches. I just don't know what offensive coach in their right freaking mind wants this job. I mean, you have to do a complete schematic overhaul. Everybody on that roster, I don't want to say you throw the tape out, but man, like, it is such a unique system. It just looks like a different sport at times. The offensive line could take a step back if you want to do more traditional drop back passing game stuff. I want to be careful with this because Devon Achane is incredible, but he's about to become extremely expensive, and I'll just say he is a uniquely special fit in a Mike McDaniel's system, and he's your best offensive player right now. Jalen Waddle is there, which is nice, but it's a tough sell to an offensive coach. It's gonna be a long, a longer rebuild here for whoever takes this job. That's why it's further down the list here. So I don't see it being an offensive coach. I also don't see them, I think a big reason they fired Mike McDaniel is they feel like he's a nerd and it's not a tough locker room. And there's a lot of talk about this team isn't physical enough. I think the zig to the zag choice here is to go with a defensive coach as well. So that's why those are the top three candidates. And for me, obviously, we sent Chris Shula to Arizona, so he's not available in this scenario. I do definitely think that's very likely if he doesn't go somewhere else. Miami, Chris Shula makes a lot of sense. But yeah, Jeff Hafley would be the other one. I think outside of the Giants and the Ravens, the Dolphins are the easiest to predict in terms of narrowing it down to two candidates here. Now, they got to pick an offensive coordinator here, so why not recreate the Hafley-LaFleur magic and hire Mike LaFleur from the LA Rams? He, in many ways, reminds me of Clint Kubiak, where not only is it like the last name carries a lot of weight, but Clint was the offensive coordinator in Minnesota at a very young age. Mike LaFleur was the offensive coordinator for the Jets at a very young age, goes back to working under the guru. It was Shanahan for Kubiak, and now it's LaFleur working back under McVay. Gets that second opportunity and looks much better. So I would definitely be willing to kick the tires on Mike LaFleur, who's only 38 years old. I love that connection. I think that is just a lot of fun, right? You got the Green Bay GM, you got Jeff Hafley, you got Mike LaFleur. Wouldn't be the least bit surprised if that happens. I think promoting Frank Smith, who has been the offensive coordinator there, but obviously not calling plays. I think they have an asset there in-house in Frank Smith that could work. And then Josh Grizzard's another name I wrote down, just staying there in Florida. He, I believe, was under McDaniel, before he left for the Bucs offensive coordinator job. So there's some familiarity there as well. But I think Mike LaFleur with Jeff Hafley in Miami makes the utmost sense and would be a really fun staff. I would love to see those guys get kind of that clean slate together, bridge their way through the Tua thing. Hopefully Miami gives them a nice 2-3 year runway. I wouldn't expect too much right away. But that's a staff I could really believe in if I were a Dolphins fan. So let's go to our last team here, the Cleveland Browns. And they are, like, organizationally, they're a mess. Deshaun Watson is still in that building. The owner meddles. You have to go and work with a GM that I think is very highly respected, but at the same time, his drafts until this year have been really bad. But at the same time, in terms of what makes sense for them, it's actually very cozy and convenient to try to slot in what makes sense for the Browns. And I actually kind of get excited thinking about it. Just get an offensive coach in there that actually can scheme up offense in a way that I really do think Kevin Stefanski has struggled to pivot from his system, to get more creative, to get some of the interesting playmakers they have involved. It's like 1 week they do it with David Njoku, and then they just forget about it. Jerry Jeudy was a disaster this year. I would love Mike McDaniel here. I would love it. It would be one of my favorite hires of this cycle. Like I said with Mike McDaniel, he is someone that you gotta find the right puzzle to put him into. You don't want to square peg round hole him. He's got this kind of nerdy personality. His system is very unique. Like I said, you want to pair him, I think, with someone else that balances him from a personality standpoint. Again, I'm not saying that the team's not going to play physical for Mike McDaniel, but I think having a former head coach in this building that everybody loves in Jim Schwartz paired with Mike McDaniel, it's brilliant. I love that combination, almost as like co-head coaches. And then I also think, like, from a quarterback standpoint, I kind of like Shedeur in a Mike McDaniel offense. I think he can do a lot of the Tua stuff, kind of throwing some of those throws over the middle of the field, trying to get him to trust the offense a little bit. And if it's not Shedeur, I actually wouldn't be surprised if Dylan Gabriel gets back into the mix there. You got the lefty QB, familiarity with that, but more specifically, Dylan Gabriel has his flaws, as Tua had his flaws, but what he does do is trust the system and get the ball out to his first read quickly on time. So I actually think as a temporary pairing until they can find the right fit, McDaniel can absolutely come in here and just get this offense working. I would love to see the creative things he can do with those tight ends. We saw him finally get the tight end he's been seeking in Darren Waller, and it really worked. He did some great stuff with Jonnu Smith as well the year before. So you've got Harold Fannin, you've got David Njoku. I think that could really work in this offense. You have speed at wide receiver. Look, Jerry Jeudy had a horrible year. I know this is crazy to say, but there is some Jalen Waddle in there in terms of the quick separation. You have someone like Isaiah Bond with speed in that room as well. From a personnel standpoint, just for Mike McDaniel to come in and take an offense that was extremely frustrating and most weeks unplayable from Kevin Stefanski, lift it up to some consistent form of itself, and then pair that with Jim Schwartz and this defense, dude, I can't think of a better fit for Mike McDaniel than the Cleveland Browns. So that is my prediction here. Now, I do want to at least give a couple other names in case that doesn't happen. Grant Udinski, taking a risk there, but a fun risk if you're the Browns. I don't know if Udinski wants that to be. Like, if you're Udinski and you're taking a head coaching job right now, I think it's if Baltimore comes calling, right? Or like you get a opportunity that's hard to say no to a more stable environment. So I think from the Browns' perspective, Udinski would be a ton of fun. I don't know if he wants to take that. And then if you want a lame candidate, Jim Schwartz, just to kind of see this thing through, because it is probably still another transition year for Cleveland. But if he's loved in that building, they did interview him for the head coaching job. You know, if you really strike out and don't really love your choices, it's maybe something we see is Jim Schwartz as kind of a lame duck style hire, just to get them through a year. And maybe they even work it out where they're like, you can still come back as the DC after that, but we just need someone to get us through one more year. But there you have it. There's your 9 head coach openings and my predictions. So just to recap here, we had Jesse Minter, Chargers defensive coordinator, heading to the Baltimore Ravens. We have Clint Kubiak, the Seahawks offensive coordinator, going to the Baltimore Ravens. We already have John Harbaugh in New York. I have Brian Flores leaving Minnesota to be the defensive head coach for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Matt Nagy, the controversial but maybe interesting head coach hire for the Tennessee Titans after an extended period of time as the offensive coordinator under Andy Reid. Then we have Chris Shula, the defensive coordinator for the Rams, leaving to be the Cardinals interdivision departure there, Cardinals head coach. Then we have the Las Vegas Raiders kind of settling in some ways for Kevin Stefanski. The Dolphins recreating Green Bay on South Beach there with Jeff Hafley. And Mike McDaniel, one of my favorite fits there for the Cleveland Browns. Now, we're not done. We have a list of coordinator openings that I'm just going to kind of go a little more simplistic here and just rattle off some names that make sense for me that would get me excited. These are less so predictions than having a conversation. So let's begin with the Detroit Lions, whose offensive coordinator position is open. Mike McDaniel has interviewed for this job. I love that as a fit. I think anytime I think of Mike McDaniel, I think of needing a quarterback that will trust the system, get the ball out quick, and play on time. And Jared Goff just might be the most Mike McDaniel quarterback in the league that I can possibly think of. So I do really like that fit. And I think if you're McDaniel and you want to really bounce back in a strong way, I do like the Cleveland fit, obviously. But other than that, killing it with the Lions, getting them back to the Super Bowl contention window with a great fit like Jared Goff, really like that. And obviously getting to be in that environment, everything else is going to take care of itself. So Mike McDaniel would be a dream if you're the Lions offensive coordinator, or if you're a Lions fan. But I think rolling the dice with like Grant Udinski, you'd be at a huge risk of losing him within a year. But I mean, if you want to go for it, absolutely. And I also really like bringing Jim Bob Cooter home. Give him another chance as the Lions offensive coordinator. A lot has changed. I don't know how Lions fans feel about him, but I would like him there. And then a couple of the names I wrote down would be Thomas Brown and Mike LaFleur. Just good options for Lions play caller this year. Okay, then we're sticking in the NFC North. So the Vikings, I do think lose Brian Flores. And I think if you're the Vikings, your best path is to try to find someone that can maybe recreate Brian Flores. I think it's kind of a fork in the roads moment if you lose Flores, because it's like, do you just accept that there's only one Brian Flores that could do what he did with this defense and kind of admit that you're not going to be able to recreate that? I think that would be a rational point of thought and go with more of a traditional defensive coach. Or do you either hire internally or look at the Bill Belichick coaching tree and see if maybe somebody could recreate what Flores did? So some of the options for the recreate Brian Flores route is internally. It seems Durante Jones maybe has been the guy that's been studying Flores and being groomed to be the replacement, knowing that they were going to lose Flores at some point. And by the way, even if Flores doesn't get a head coaching job, there is a raising narrative that he might just leave. I have no idea why, but something to keep an eye on. But yeah, Durante Jones is like the in-house guy. And then another name that just kind of disappeared from the face of the earth is Gerard Mayo. Was obviously the Patriots head coach last year, and things just did not go well. But he is in the Belichick tree. He has not been coaching this year. He kind of just took a year off. I would be fascinated in Gerard Mayo as a Brian Flores-esque entity in the Belichick system to maybe come in and do some of that stuff. Likewise, Matt Patricia over there at Ohio State, same idea. So there's your kind of like Belichick system, Brian Flores. But the thing is, like, Flores has branched pretty far off of the Belichick coaching tree. So that's a risk to assume some of those guys could come in and do that. That's why Durante Jones maybe makes sense. Or, like I said, do you just look at the best defensive coordinator candidates and go in a different route? So are you talking about Jim Leonard, Aiden Durd? There's a huge list of names that are going to come up here as we're talking. Matt Burke. Try to just get a highly qualified DC, and even if you're changing the system, you're getting the right coach. So there's kind of a fork in the roads there for the Vikings, which route they want to go. Green Bay Packers, who I think are very likely going to be losing Jeff Hafley here. So I wanted to fill their spot. The Packers almost always promote internally. In this case, that would scare me. I think they've been depleted from a defensive staff perspective at this point because they did lose the guy that it really sucks that the Jags had the foresight to get Anthony Campanelli, because that would be ideal, right? Is Jeff Hafley leaves and you have Anthony Campanelli's the next most qualified guy to kind of step into that role. There's not really anybody on the Packers staff that would get me excited at all, but I am scared for the Packers' sake. Like, they are very stubborn in their ways in terms of internal promotions, especially when it's a guy leaving. Like they found Matt LaFleur after they fired McCarthy, obviously. They went for Rich Bisaccia after they fired their special teams coordinator. But usually when it's like things are going well and someone gets hired elsewhere, it's internal promotions. I don't like the existing options in Green Bay, but they're going to be considered. And I would be a little bit nervous here. So the one guy that I really don't want them to promote, and I tweeted this out, and it's nothing personal, but I would be, as a Packers fan, I would be horrified if they promote Derek Ansley to defensive coordinator, which I think is the next guy in the pecking order here. I mean, he was in charge of their secondary this year, a secondary that vastly struggled. I mean, they couldn't catch the football, some of the worst ball skills I've ever seen from a secondary. He was a new hire. And the thing with him is it's not just that. The biggest thing on his resume is he was with the Chargers in the Brandon Staley regime that was a nightmare. And he was their DB coach and passing game coordinator, and then he was actually promoted to defensive coordinator, ironically, after the Packers hired Joe Barry. Derek Ansley was promoted to defensive coordinator that last year when the defense was horrible, and it got everybody fired. So that's a guy that I would be really scared if the Packers promote that. So I just want to call that out now in case it happens, because I think it's very possible. The other guy that is in-house is DeMarcus Covington. I would be less afraid of this than Ansley. Covington was the Patriots' de facto defensive coordinator underneath Gerard Mayo. And, he's been the D-line coach. I think he did an okay job with this defensive line. I think I just trust him a little bit more if they were to promote him, but those are going to be two strong candidates for Green Bay as those internal promotions, because that's what they do. But I would highly encourage Green Bay to look outside of your building and try to get a really high qualified defensive coordinator to replace Jeff Hafley. So for me, three names that make a lot of sense for them. Jim Leonard, who's a Wisconsin guy, was the Wisconsin DC, and I think they even offered him a position in the past, and he didn't take it potentially, but love that. The scheme is different, but for me, it's look, the Packers have had a good defensive coordinator the last 2 years for the first time in like 15 years. Like, that's what I don't want to change. And I think Leonard would find some very creative ways as well to use Micah Parsons. You would have to change up the front a little bit, but I would love Jim Leonard. Matt Burke, if you want to keep with more of the same scheme, Matt Burke makes the utmost sense. This would maybe even be my favorite. Matt Burke has been under DeMeco Ryans in Houston, and this Jeff Hafley system at large is in that same coaching tree. Under Robert Saleh, DeMeco Ryans, Jeff Hafley was in that same tree as well. So I think Matt Burke should come highly recommended, and he can go from defensive coordinator of the Texans to defensive coordinator here because he would be the play caller, the guy in charge there. So I would love Matt Burke. Aiden Durd, another guy, if you want to, maybe a little bit of a different scheme, but think outside the box a little bit, make an appeal to a guy that might have head coach aspirations. If Durd's not getting a head coach offer, come to a defense with Micah Parsons and a lot of talent, have a great year, and go get a head coaching job somewhere else next year. And then Jeff Ulbrich as well, if he were to become available. Again, I think he's probably back in Atlanta, but there's a lot of Robert Saleh connections with Jeff Ulbrich, and him coming here would make sense. So there's like four names there that you could really make an appeal for, I think, if you're the Packers. So I would really hate to see them promote internally when I think they can aim bigger, man. I just don't, and it's not like Covington and Ansley haven't had opportunities. They weren't the play callers, but in both situations, when Ansley was the DC with the Chargers, everybody got fired. When Covington was the DC with the Patriots, everybody got fired. So just saying that, getting ahead of it. Let's go to the Eagles offensive coordinator here. Thank God Kevin Patullo's gone, right? Or at least demoted. They didn't fire him outright, but at least last I saw. But this is a huge opportunity. I mean, this is just like we saw with Kellen Moore. Like, he's going to look at this like, man, that's a great opportunity to step in. Now, it's not quite what it was a couple years ago. Like, there's a lot of uncertainty with A.J. Brown at this point. The offensive line is certainly not what it once was. You're going to have questions about Lane Johnson and his long-term situation there, but still an attractive spot, I think. And I've been saying this for weeks, and it's been reported now for about a week that their top guy is Brian Daboll. Familiarity there, both with Saquon Barkley and interdivision. I think they probably have a lot of respect for the play calling of Brian Daboll. And mobile quarterback, shotgun offense, it just makes so much sense. I mean, Brian Daboll is a supercharged version of the system that they have tried to create around Jalen Hurts. So I really like that. Daboll is very familiar as well with working with quarterbacks that are, well, Daboll's worked with inexperienced quarterbacks, a young Josh Allen, a young Jackson Dart, quarterbacks that he's used to trying to create easier reads. And, even Daniel Jones to an extent is limited as a passer in many ways. I think catering to those quarterbacks' skill sets, especially a young Josh Allen, not obviously late career Josh Allen, but I think working with Jalen Hurts would be a point of comfort with Brian Daboll. So I really like that fit, and I think it gets done. But I think Cliff Kingsbury would be a good fit as well. Another chance to get back at the Commanders. Like, hey, why'd you let this guy go? I think his offense would work just perfectly fine with Jalen Hurts. Jim Bob Cooter as well is another guy that would make a ton of sense. As the Shane Steichen disciple, what better than to try to get some of that back? They lost Shane Steichen years ago when Hurts had his best year. Try to recreate that system would make so much sense. So for me, those three guys, it's got to be one of the three. All three of those are super obvious choices. I've seen Mike McDaniel thrown out there for the Eagles. I actually don't think that's a fit with Jalen Hurts' skill set at all. We haven't really seen Mike McDaniel do too much from a quarterback run game perspective, though I think he could. But specifically in the passing game, Jalen Hurts is not, to me, a Mike McDaniel scheme fit. He is the opposite of Tua in the sense of like hitting the top of his drop and throwing anticipatory throws over the middle of the field. Like that is probably the biggest weakness in Jalen Hurts' game. So I don't see that really as a fit with Mike McDaniel. I just wanted to call that out. All right, Commanders offensive coordinator. We got 2 openings for the Commanders here. Offensive coordinator. It sounds like they are interested in going to the like Shanahan system and kind of create that mold in Washington. So you can kind of go down the list of all your candidates there, whether it's Mike LaFleur, Drew Petzing, Zach Robinson, maybe Bobby Slowick. You could give Frank Smith a call. There's a lot of coaches out there in that role, even the other Kubiak, Clay Kubiak, like there's a huge list. Like the Shanahan tree runs so deep that it's not too hard to find a play caller with experience in that system. If you swing big, Grant Udinski would be a really fun spot for Udinski to get to work with Jaden Daniels and Terry McLaurin in this offense, a good offensive line, have a great year, go get a head coaching job somewhere else next year. I like Brian Daboll is a fit here as well. It was pretty clear that he liked Jaden Daniels from that Hard Knocks that we got to see, so there should be some appeal there. And I like Jim Bob Cooter. Again, really a good spread system that Jaden Daniels could run really well. You get some easy stuff schemed up there on top of a handful of pro-style concepts as well. So you can go in a lot of different directions for the Commanders, but it's going to be an attractive job, I think, with Jaden and the O-line and Terry McLaurin. And then for Commanders defensive coordinator, I mean, I don't want to spend too much time on this because, look, Dan Quinn was brought in here to be the defensive coach, but it seems quite clear that he just wants to coast, man. He just wants to be the CEO. And they're interviewing Brian Flores. I just want to say, man, if they can land Brian Flores, absolutely, dude. Like, absolutely. I don't fully understand it, what all is going on behind the scenes if Flores leaves Minnesota to be the defensive coordinator for this defense under Dan Quinn. But another name that I could absolutely see here is Aiden Durd, who coached with Dan Quinn in Dallas. So there's a strong connection there. And Durd could be the defensive coordinator here. Although I don't know if there's complications there because you are still under a defensive head coach. So I don't know how the rules exactly play out there if he can actually leave Seattle to be under Dan Quinn in Washington. But if he's allowed to do that, I think him reunited with Dan Quinn would be excellent. So keep an eye on Flores and Durd as like amazing candidates for the Commanders. Otherwise, I'm just like, dude, Dan Quinn figured it out, man. Like, he's going to hire a different DC, but it gets pretty murky there when you hired him to be the defensive coach and he's very quickly like, I'm good. I'm just going to be the CEO and blame other people. Like, okay. Why are you here? I'm firing everything from like firing Cliff Kingsbury makes no sense to me to just directing blame at everybody else for the defense. I'm just pretty out on Dan Quinn right now. We're going to stick in the NFC East with our next one. The Cowboys defensive coordinator position is open. And I'm going to go back to that name, Aiden Durd, returning to Dallas after learning the Mike Macdonald system the last couple of years. I would love to see Dallas be the next team that implements that system. I think you've got a variety of different body types on the D-line, a bunch of interior guys, edge guys, you name it. I would love to see this cornerback room get the most out of those by playing a lot of zone coverage and a well-coached unit. I think Aiden Durd returning to Dallas as defensive coordinator would be phenomenal. Matt Burke, another one. where you keep him in the state of Texas, let him run the defense. I would love that as a fit. Anthony Weaver. Likewise, I do like the idea of the Mike Macdonald system in Dallas, and Anthony Weaver would be running that. So those were three names for the Cowboys defensive coordinator I would like to see. Next up, we have the Bucs offensive coordinator. This is my favorite one, and I would very much anticipate this being a possibility if he doesn't get a head coaching job. Grant Udinski for the Bucs offensive coordinator job. He's got to be your number one focus here because, God, there's just so many things to love about this. There are heavy, heavy ties here. Number one, just staying in the state of Florida. But Baker Mayfield has been in this style system his whole career. Grant Udinski as well in the Shanahan-McVay family tree. And Udinski just learned under Liam Cohen who the Bucs miss quite badly. So you're able to kind of recapture the Liam Cohen magic. You get an offensive coordinator here that I would not be surprised if this played out to finally be for the first time a team with a defensive head coach makes the call to move on from the defensive coach in an effort to keep the offensive guy. I think this would work so well. You've got Baker, you've got an offensive line, you have all these receivers. What a fit this would be. And I would not be the least bit surprised if this comes with the promise that as soon as you're ready, or if you get an offer for a head coaching job elsewhere, come back to us and give us the option to fire Todd Bowles and promote him. I think this might be the first time we actually see that. Really an exciting potential fit there. But I also do like this as a Mike McDaniel fit. Like I said, Mike McDaniel with a veteran quarterback that's willing to trust an offense and throw over the middle of the field with anticipation. I think Baker could run Mike McDaniel's system. Hell, there's connections there. Josh Grizzard came over from Mike McDaniel's offense. So it's not an eye for an eye, but it could be a nice meeting in the middle of the road where McDaniel brings some of his genius guru, I almost said crap. It's not crap. It's genius guru stuff. And Baker and these receivers almost are good for Mike McDaniel a little bit to get a little bit more pro-style drop-back stuff that we just didn't see as much with Tua there. I also like Brian Daboll for the Bucs. I do. I think Daboll, he just loves working with, excuse me, there goes the voice. It just totally gave out on me. But I think Brian Daboll likes working with competitors, and that's what Baker Mayfield is. So it would be a scheme change, but maybe that could be good for Baker at this stage in his career. And then there's other Shanahan scheme options. Zach Robinson, Bobby Slowick, Mike LaFleur, all would make sense. It's going to be an attractive job, so I think they'll find a good answer there for the Bucs OC. Then we have our last team that has any openings that I could think of. And if I did forget any current openings or expected openings, let me know in the comments down below, and I'll try to get back with a response on who would make sense there. But yeah, the Chargers fully anticipating, Jesse Minter. I think by the time this podcast is up, Jesse Minter will be a Raven. But fully expecting their defensive coordinator position to be open. I'm not, if it's not broken, don't fix it. So I would stick with the same Mike Macdonald style system. And I'm just going down the board of your top candidates in that system. And for me, it's a clear pecking order. Number one, Aiden Durd. I would give him a call and see if you can pull that off. That's a unique situation where he's technically a DC, but man, I am a big fan of Aiden Durd. He's a little more risky though, because you would lose him almost immediately. I think if he had success, he would be gone in a year. So if you want to thread the needle a little bit more and find a guy that maybe isn't gonna depart in a year, although maybe he still would, and you got to kind of take him from your brother too. That's what's fascinating here is both these guys are going to be vying for the defensive coaches, and it's not like John Harbaugh's taken Zach Orr with him. I don't think. Maybe he does, but Anthony Weaver. I think we might see a bidding war between John and Jim Harbaugh trying to get Anthony Weaver from Miami, who I think is doing the best job. Like Durd's obviously under McDonald. of the coordinators available, assuming he's available for Miami, who we expect to go with a defensive head coach there, I think Anthony Weaver is going to be a hot commodity to implement this Mike Macdonald system, or in this case, continue it. So Anthony Weaver would be an excellent hire here. And then if you can't pry dirt out of Seattle and Weaver goes to the Giants, I think your next option's probably Denard Wilson from the Titans if they don't bring him back. I think he's done an okay job. And the reason I'm going with all these external candidates is looking at the Chargers staff, there's not really a clear-cut guy, in my opinion, to take over. Like Navarro Bowman would be fun. I'm down. I love Navarro Bowman, one of the most underrated players of the decade, in my opinion. Tremendous linebacker. I would love to see him here. Don't get me wrong, but I think he's first or second year coach. So that's pretty fresh. But I would be down. And then Steve Clinkscale, I think, has done a phenomenal job with their secondary. Those are probably your options. I'm open to the idea of those guys just getting promoted and doing a great job here. And I think both those guys have done a good job with their respective units as well. So there's that. And then for the Chargers offensive coordinator, this will be a fun one. You get to work with Herbert and the tackles coming back and a receiving unit that, man, was that a good group of receivers this year. My favorite for this job is Jim Bob Cooter. He's got the Shane Steichen connection, which Steichen did a great job with Herbert back in, 2021. But I just like the scheme fit here. You've got a bunch of different guys to distribute the ball with, which we just saw in Indy, getting all those different guys involved. I think the run game is prolific. I think you can use Herbert as a design runner. Not a ton, but you can implement it. I think the drop back stuff, there's a long history, like Jim Bob Cooter working with Matthew Stafford and some of the throws he can make. There's a lot of similarities between Stafford and Herbert as a passer. So for me, Jim Bob Cooter is 1A, 1B, 1C. We got to get this guy in here. He is the perfect fit for the Chargers. Otherwise, I guess, I don't think it's a big Mike McDaniel fit. I just, Herbert is more of a longer developing, push the ball down. I just don't see the Mike McDaniel Herbert fit really. Not that he couldn't run McDaniel's offense, but it just doesn't quite make sense to me. I do think Brian Daboll, certainly getting to work with Herbert. There's some Josh Allen in there for sure, but just some of the other names that I would like here: Mike LaFleur staying in LA, Bobby Slowick getting another opportunity. I would be down. I think Slowick did a great job with Stroud in his rookie year. And as we've seen, there's some other issues there in Houston. It's not like the new coordinator was a massive upgrade from Bobby Slowick. So, I think you can make a case that this was a really hot name a year ago, and the Texans kind of threw him under the bus. I would be super down to see him in this offense. Zach Robinson, I don't think was bad in Atlanta. I think he would be a good choice. Recently resided in LA as well, so you can bring him back home. He was with the Rams just a year ago, or 2 years ago maybe. And then Thomas Brown as well, another LA guy, originally was with the Rams. But I would be interested. Thomas Brown just got Drake May. There's a lot of similarities between Drake May and Justin Herbert. So see what that can look like with Thomas Brown as the Chargers offensive coordinator. So there you have it. There is the whole coaching carousel show. This is always one of my favorites. I'm going to wrap this up here so I can get this out ASAP. Every second counts when these guys are going to start getting hired here over the next few days for sure. So I hope you guys enjoyed. Please do hit that like button if you did. Make sure you're subscribed. Again, check out Patreon for studs and duds if you don't want to miss out on that, or become a member here on YouTube. But that's all I got. Thank you so much for watching, for listening, and we'll talk soon. Cheers.